Hi, my name is Jazz Cole, and I will be talking about ways to make language learning easy. Obviously, language learning is not always easy. You actually have a whole sense of work that actually has to be done in order to master a language fully to at least a C1 level. But I want to be able to give you a structure so it's not so overwhelming and it's not so difficult to get started, or even if you've gotten started and then just fell out of that pattern, I want to basically be able to give you ways of just structuring it to where it's easier and it's bite-sized pieces so you're not overwhelmed by trying to learn the whole language. The first thing you should ever learn how to learn in any language is the grammatical structure. So typically in English, we have the SVO, subject, verb, object structure. In French, I know that they have that as well. Or in German, they have the same structure, but then the second action verb, if there are two verbs in one sentence, the second one goes to the very end. So the next thing is verb conjugation. So after you understand how their sentence structure functions, then you can get into the sense of subject and verb. Verbs that are conjugated. That's sometimes the hardest part, but conjugation is pretty much easy to understand. You just have to memorize the pattern. It is always the same thing. Such as in French verbs. When you look at that, I teach that language the most. The main thing is just learning the indicative of every single verb ending. You know, we have, like, for example, with the verb parler. Je parle, tu parles, il, elle, on parle, nous parlons, vous parlez, il parle. With those endings that you see, those are actually going to be seen in several different forms of tenses and moods. Also, learning the different moods is very important because not only are you learning the timeline, which is typically indicative in the French learning space. So that is usually facts anytime you're talking about history, anything that happened this time, past, present, future. You're most likely going to be using indicative. Conditional is when you're typically using hypotheticals or talking about possibilities. Then you have subjunctive when you're talking about opinions or things that you may or may not know to be fact or not. So those types of things you're going to really want to focus on. And not only that, but when you look at futur simple in the French language, if you look at how that's structured, the endings are actually avoir present conjugation just on the end of the verb, and you don't change anything. So you'll kind of notice patterns like that because it will help you further develop your language skills. The other thing is auxiliary verbs, because auxiliary verbs basically control whether you're talking about present or past, especially since I make a lot of references to French because I teach that the most. But with French auxiliary verbs, you can manipulate them to say anything you want. You can say things like, I have something. J'ai un souris. You know, I have a computer mouse. But you can also say past things like j'ai parlé, I spoke, or I have spoken with the past participle. You can use that in imparfait to say I had, especially when it comes to age, because you have age and you aren't the age. Like, j'ai appris français depuis que j'avais 11 ans. I have been learning French since I was 11 years old. Since I had 11 years. You also have futur simple, j'aurai. So I will have. J'aurai terminé ce vidéo dans un peu minutes. I will have finished this video in a few minutes. Then you have the conditional, like I could have, j'aurais, which is the same pronunciation. I'm going to be honest with you, in French, the same pronunciation, but there are so many different ways to pronounce the same general thing. J'ai, j'avais, parlerai, je serai, et, tu es. There's so many different things. Vous parlez, like ways to make the same sounds, like the same endings. In pronunciation, it is so much easier because it's the same thing. You don't have to memorize any different, this is spelled differently. No, it sounds exactly the same. So you can really manipulate the auxiliary verbs to say a whole bunch of different things. The other thing I would say is to focus on pronunciation when it comes to speaking, because you're going to learn everything in 4 different ways of speaking: reading, writing, speaking, and listening. So when you are focusing on speaking, really focus on how things are said. Like the alphabet is where I would say you should pretty much start, because if you know how each letter of the alphabet is pronounced, you're actually going to be able to sound out words yourselves. Don't forget about accent marks. Understand how accent marks are going to change the letter, the sound of the letter that is in that language. So that's really important to pay attention to. I know in German, they really don't have any accent marks except the Umlaute, which is the 2 dots above, and they're usually seen above the A, the O, and the U, those 3 vowels. You also have the S-set, which is this little beta-looking symbol, which basically means a sharp S. Sometimes different letters are not pronounced the same way as in English, just like the letter W in German is pronounced like a V. And the V is pronounced like an F, and an F is just an F. So learning those things are going to help you be able to pronounce things differently, especially like guttural R. If you are a person who's learning Spanish, your R is going to come from the front of your mouth, and you need to practice that so your vocal muscles are able to get used to saying or to pronouncing those letters in that way. So Spanish, you have a R, and then in French, you have a ch. They also use that same sound in German. So if you're learning either of those, the R as well as the CH sound in German is going to sound very harsh. So you need to learn those things so you can be very clearly understood. Pronunciation across the board out of all the languages I have learned has been the number one thing people have complimented me on. The next thing I will say is to focus on not vocabulary, but focus on just making sure you're able to communicate what you want to say. It is not important to learn every single fruit that is in existence. That's great if you are going into a profession that involves food. Like for example, if you are planning on studying abroad in, let's say, France to learn like culinary arts, great, that is fantastic. But if you are not, that is not very important unless you are going to a restaurant, and most likely at restaurants you are not going to be ordering every single fruit that is in existence. Like, focus on what you really need to learn. Vocabulary will come over time as you are exposing yourself. So in addition to like learning things, let's say on Duolingo, I'm going to be honest with you, can get boring after a while. Like, it's a tool to get started, but it is not where you are going to get fluent. So you want to like find things. That's why I always tell people it's a great idea to even invest in a VPN, because you can find lots of different international content based on what particular language or whatever country is speaking the language that you are trying to learn. I think you should also be looking at like blog posts or things from actual native speakers, so you can actually get exposed to day to day how it's spoken. Change your devices in another language so that you'll be able to see certain things. As an adult learning a language, your focus is not on vocabulary, it's more specific. As an adult, you are learning how to talk about your careers. That is more vocabulary specific, because you're only needing to learn vocabulary that is based on your career. So if you are, let's say, going into international business that involves engineering, you're only going to need to learn the vocabulary that is relevant to engineering. And of course, you want to learn all those other things, like basically getting around like A1 type topics, like giving you basic information and things like that. Ordering a coffee at a cafe or something like that. But you really don't need that if you're using it for a specific purpose. My main thing is just get exposure to real world things. That's going to enrich your vocabulary. You're going to learn more about different synonyms, like things that simple words that you use for, talking about something being beautiful. You're going to learn that maybe there are other words to say things are good or something is beautiful. Or something. You're going to diversify your vocabulary so you're not using basic words that are typically learned in A1. If you want to get up to B1, which is standard for international work, you will want to learn vocabulary, like industry-specific vocabulary. And also, my last thing is, when you're learning to read things, learn how to read through context. So, for example, with conjugation, if you're trying to learn about passé composé versus imparfait, because both of those things are past tenses, but they're referring to them in different ways. So learning to look at temporal words to indicate what tense are they talking about. So especially if it's words you're not familiar with. So for example, if you're looking at imparfait, you might hear words like toujours, like always. You might hear words like depuis, like since, or like since my youth, or quand j'avais 11 ans, like since back when I had 11 years, those kinds of things, because you want to make sure that you're able to train your brain to be able to figure things out versus using translation tools all the time. Like even with reading books, even there might be words where I'm just like, I can't figure out, of course, but it will save you a lot of time not trying to look up every single word, learning to read in context, which is what I teach my students on a regular basis. So I hope this was helpful, and let me know in the comments if there's anything that you have in terms of tips that would really be helpful. Till next time.